Today I thought it'd be interesting to look at the Old Testament book of Genesis. That's the very first book in the Bible. And the book of Genesis lays the foundation for everything else in the Bible. Now the word Genesis simply means origin. The book of Genesis starts out with the phrase, "in the beginning." And in Genesis we find the formative events of everything. The formative events that will play on out as the Bible goes on. So the things that happen in Genesis really set the stage for everything else in the Bible. Now, the first thing that Genesis tells us is that we are here and things are here because God created it all. Why is there existence? Because God made it. We're not here as an accident. We're not here as a result of random forces coming together. We're here from the determination of God because God created it. Now, Genesis does not tell us why God created the world, just that He did. And Genesis also tells us that when God initially created the world, everything was good. But then it very soon tells us that things are no longer the way God initially created them and the way God intended. And the reason for that is connected to Adam and Eve eating the fruit of a tree that God told them not to eat. After that happened, somehow things changed. What God created was somehow spoiled. Now, exactly why and how things were spoiled is a matter of question. And you can basically look at that in two ways. First, you could look at it as that God told Adam and Eve not to eat this fruit, and they went ahead and did it. And so God got mad, He flew off the handle, and He spoiled everything as punishment for them eating the fruit. And so God spoiled everything Himself. He just got mad, threw a tantrum, and this is what resulted from it. There's another way you could look at it, though. You could look at it that Adam and Eve ate the fruit, and then something happened when they ate the fruit. Something that God did not want to happen, but this happened, and it was beyond God's control to stop it at that very moment. And you can see there's a big difference between those two. It's like this. Let's say here you've got an outbuilding out at your house. Your grandchild comes over, and they start to crawl up under that building. And you say, now don't crawl up under that building. If you do, I'll spank you. And so they crawl up under the building, you drag them out, and you spank them. That's the first one. That's the one that says God flew off the handle and just ruined everything because He got mad. The second one is like you say, now don't crawl up under that building. And you tell them not to crawl up under that building because you've seen a snake up under there. And you're afraid they'll get bit by that snake. And sure enough, that's what happens. They crawl up under there and then you hear, and they get bit by that snake. That's the second one. So those are the two ways you can look at how things got spoiled. And this debate has been going on in Christianity really since the beginning. We assume it's the first one. The one where they crawl up under the building and you drag them out and spank them, because that's what we've been told it is. But you can make a really good case that it's the second one. That God didn't want everything to be ruined, but when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, something else caused it. And God at that moment could not stop it at that time. This is a very important point to consider, because how you answer that, which one of those you choose, will dictate your view of God. Everything about your view of God will flow from which one of those you choose. If you choose one, your view of God will go that way. If you choose the other, it will go the other way. And they're irreconcilable. Can't be both. It has to be one or the other. Now, I will tell you that I reject the first one. The one that says that God flew off the handle and spoiled everything, I believe it is the second one, that some outside influence that God could not control at that moment came in and spoiled it. Now, at any rate, what we've talked about so far happens in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and then it moves on to other things. And really, Genesis contains some of the most ancient narratives that have survived in recorded history. Things that happened way back before recorded history. Now, biblical scholars have studied the book of Genesis, its style of writing in there, and the way things are presented. And there is a view today that I find fairly compelling. I'm not sure this is the case, but you can make a good case for this. That you have 4 different sections in the book of Genesis. And each of these sections seems to contain material that were pulled from other sources that have not survived, and they have been combined to form what we have today. You can look at the book of Genesis as 4 self-contained sections that have been combined to form the one book of Genesis. Now, the first section starts with the part we talked about, the creation and the fall, and then it goes on to tell of things that are very different from today. It talks about people living to be 800 or 900 years old. It talks about people having children when they're 500 years old. And then we see something very interesting. We see an account of something called the sons of God coming to earth and having sex with human women. And no one knows who these sons of God are from the book of Genesis. They are presented as some kind of heavenly beings, and they look down and they see human women and they get desirous of human women, so they come down here and start having sex with them. And children are born as a result of that. It results in a race of giants, and these giants are called evil. They are part human, part something else. And horrible things start happening in the world. And that's what you can say is the first part of Genesis. The second section begins with the account of Noah and the flood. Now, we talked earlier about how God created the world and created it good, and things got spoiled, though, and they were no longer the way God wanted them. Genesis tells us that things got so bad that God regretted ever having created the world in the first place, and he decided to destroy all the human beings on the world. And then he thought, well, no, I'm going to destroy every living thing on the face of the earth. Just wipe out all life whatsoever. And so God decided to do that. But there was a man named Noah, and we are told that Noah pleased God, and instead of destroying everything, God told Noah to build an ark. And he told Noah to take his family and go in that ark, take 2 of every living thing on earth and put it in that ark. Noah does that. They all go in, and the flood comes and wipes out every living thing on the earth except for Noah and his family and the living things in the ark. And with them, God is going to start over again. And so the flood ends and they all come out. And one thing that this account tells us is that God has a soft heart. Because after destroying everything with this flood, it says that God regrets it. And God says, well, I'm never going to do this again. And God vows, I will never do something like this again. And the sign he gives to Noah of that vow is the rainbow. God's attempt to start over again didn't work out very well. As soon as the floodwaters recede and everything starts getting back to normal, it starts getting back to bad. And so God's plan to fix everything did not work. And then we see the account of the Tower of Babel. We heard that as our reading from Genesis earlier. People were living together and they were getting powerful and they decided to start accomplishing things. And they did accomplish things, and they decided to build a tower to reach all the way to the heaven. And they started doing that, and God looked down there and said, you know, there's nothing these people won't be able to do. We've got to stop them some way. So God confused all their languages, gave them all different languages so they couldn't understand each other, and they spread them out over all the world. And we are told that God did this because he was afraid of what they might be able to accomplish. So that's the second section. It deals with Noah and the flood and how God wiped out every living thing in an attempt to start over. But that attempt didn't work out very well because things soon turned sour again. And then we come to the third section. And it starts reading very different, although it has some strange things in it. The third section begins to become more normal. This section begins with God's promise to a man named Abraham. And we're not told much about Abraham except that Abraham was a person. We're not told he was especially righteous or an especially religious man. It just said that one day God comes to him and says, I'm going to give you a lot of descendants and make your descendants into a nation, and I'm going to give you this land to live on. And that's what's called the Promised Land. We see Abraham and his wife Sarah go into Egypt and other places. And we see God promise them a son, although they're very old. Sarah believes she's too old to get pregnant, so if they're going to have a son, she's going to do it some other way. So she tells Abraham to go in with her slave girl named Hagar and have a son with her. And so Abraham has sex with Hagar, and they have a son, and the son's name is Ishmael. And when you know it, about the time Ishmael starts growing up, Sarah herself gets pregnant. She has a son named Isaac, and now she's jealous of this slave girl and the son Ishmael, and she has Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away, and he just kicks them out into the wilderness. Root, hog, or die. It's what good old Abraham tells him. Now, throughout this narrative about Abraham and Sarah, we see some interesting things. This section of the Bible corresponds with the time of the Pharaohs in Egypt. And we do see Abraham having dealings with the Egyptian Pharaoh. We see Abraham having dealings with other people. We see strange things happening here. We see God and angels appearing on earth just like human beings, talking, walking, eating, drinking. This is the part where we have the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah with fire. We have Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt. And then we have Lot's daughters getting him drunk one night and having sex with him so that they could have children and preserve the family line. We see mention made of ancient peoples and ancient cities and towns that are lost to history, and we have no idea where these towns were or who these people were. Genesis gives us a glimpse into the very ancient world. And one interesting thing to notice is that it becomes characterized by intrigue, deception, and improper dealing. We've already seen how Abraham kicked Hagar and his son Ishmael out into the desert and just told them to root, hog, or die. I'm through with you. When Ishmael, Abraham's first child, goes out into the desert, Abraham has other children later on with other women. But none of them figure into anything except Isaac. They just drop out of the account. Isaac becomes the only child of Abraham's that is important. Talk about having a favorite child. Abraham was certainly not an impartial parent. We see Isaac as a young man. We see him marrying a woman named Rebekah in an arranged marriage. And then we see Isaac and Rebekah having two sons, Jacob and Esau. Remember how Jacob tricked his father Isaac into giving him the blessing as the eldest son? And there's bad blood between Jacob and Esau because of that. And then we see Jacob going out and trying to marry a woman named Rachel, but through some kind of trick that got pulled on him, he got her sister instead. And then we see more intrigue and plotting as Rachel and Jacob finally get together. Now this Jacob guy, this is the guy that will be the father of the Hebrew people. Remember, the 12 sons of Jacob are the ancestors of the supposed 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob himself is a shyster, a trickster, a con artist, a shady character. He lives his whole life conning people, just as he conned his father, he conned his brother, he conned his father-in-law and everything his father-in-law had. His brothers-in-law come to get him, he has to flee. He not only has to run from them, he has to run from his brother Esau, because he's afraid Esau will catch up with him and get even with him. Now eventually there's a showdown between Jacob and his father-in-law. Eventually there is some kind of showdown between Jacob and Esau, and they sort of part halfway okay. And then we see the rape of one of Jacob's daughters. And we see her brothers avenge her rape. They plunder and burn and kill the inhabitants of an entire city because of that rape. And that's the end of the third section. Now the fourth section begins. And this is almost like a separate writing, in that the tone of it and the emphasis changes so much. We see Jacob again. He's an old man. And we see him now with 12 sons. His daughters, whoever they are and how many ever they are, have dropped out of the picture. They no longer play a part in anything. And now we see Jacob no longer just referred to as Jacob, but sometimes he's referred to as Israel. And Jacob has a son who is his favorite, and this is a guy named Joseph. And Joseph's brothers are jealous because he is their father's favorite, and they decide to kill him. Then they put him down in a well and they're going to kill him, but they had second thoughts about that, so they drag him out of the well and they sell him into slavery. He ends up in Egypt, and he has a skill at interpreting dreams. And Joseph is skilled at divinization, which means telling the future. He would tell the future by looking in the bottom of a wine goblet. He comes to the attention of Pharaoh because he is able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. No one else could interpret them, but Joseph could. He gets into Pharaoh's good graces and begins a rise to power in Egypt, and finally becomes a high official in the Egyptian government at Pharaoh's right hand. Now back home, where Jacob and his sons are, things aren't going so well. There's a famine. They run out of food. And Jacob sends his sons to Egypt to buy food. Now remember, unknown to them, their brother Jacob is now a high official in the Egyptian government, and they go to Egypt to buy grain, and Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him, though. And he says, I'm not going to sell you any grain until your youngest brother comes. And they plead with him, oh no. So Joseph said, well, I'm going to keep one of you captive here with me. And he chooses one of the brothers named Simeon. And he lets the others take the grain back home. And he says, I'll release this brother when you bring your youngest brother back. And so Joseph has the grain loaded up, and he secretly has the money that they used to pay for it stuffed back in their sacks. And on the way home, they noticed that their money's still there, and they're afraid. So they rush on home and unload their grain, and they find all that money, and they tell their father about it. and they're afraid to go back. And remember, they also have to tell their father that one of his sons, Simeon, is being held in Egypt until his youngest son goes. And Jacob says, no, I will not allow my youngest son to go. The brothers get desperate. And one of them, a guy named Reuben, tells his father, look, let the youngest one, whose name is Benjamin, go back. And if something happens to him and he doesn't come back, I'll let you kill my sons. Can you imagine trying to make a deal like that with your father? You know, I mean, you just think about that. But anyway, so Jacob says no. So he will not allow it. Okay. The famine continues and they run out of food again. They have no choice but to go back to Egypt to buy grain, or else they're all going to starve to death. And so Simeon is there, and they said that Joseph said not to come back until we bring Benjamin. And so Jacob said, well, okay, take him. And so they go. And they see Joseph. And Joseph invites them into the feast. And they tell Joseph, the last time we came here, our money was returned. And they said, you know, we brought it back and we brought more money now. And Joseph says, well, God must have put that money back in there because I didn't have anything to do with it. Joseph brings out their brother Simeon, loads them up with their grain, and again he puts their money back in the sacks. But this time he has his own silver cup put in Benjamin's sack. And the brothers leave. Joseph sends his soldiers out to accuse them of theft. And they find that money. And then they find that cup in Benjamin's sack. They go to Joseph and they plead for mercy. And Joseph finally tells them who he is. He tells them that he forgives them for what they did, that God took what they did for evil and turned it into good. And he says, go back and get your father and your families and move them all to Egypt. There's plenty of food here, and I'll take care of you all. And that's what they do. They move to Egypt, where they prosper, and eventually Jacob dies and is buried. Joseph dies and is buried. And the brothers and their families are prosperous in Egypt. And that's where the book of Genesis ends. They're in Egypt, and they're prosperous. These are the people who, 400 or 500 years later, descendants will leave Egypt under Moses in the book of Exodus. Now, something that's interesting to notice about this last section is throughout this last section, Joseph is the main character. Joseph is the hero who saves them all. If not for him, they would have all starved to death in the famine. He actually saved them twice. You see, even though they tried to kill him and ended up selling him into slavery, he saved them all. He saved the whole lot of the Hebrew people. The odd thing, though, is that Joseph does not become a major figure in the Old Testament. Think of the times you've heard about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Think of the times you've heard about Moses and David and Solomon and Elijah, but you seldom hear about Joseph. He is not included in the patriarchs of the Hebrews. In fact, the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, 11 of those tribes are named after the sons of Jacob. But the 12th one, is not named after Joseph. It is named after one of Joseph's sons. So out of all of the sons of Jacob, Joseph is the one that saved them all, and yet he's the only one that didn't get a tribe named after him. Now, what was it about Joseph that caused him to be basically ignored and left out of the rest of the Old Testament? That's one of the big mysteries of the Old Testament. No one knows. It's a big mystery. Why was Joseph ignored? No one knows. There's different opinions about it, but no one knows. You see, there's a lot in the book of Genesis. It's actually one of the most complicated books in the entire Bible. It takes us back to a very ancient time. And it takes us back to where things are a lot different than they are today. So different that we really can't imagine it. And it talks about things happening. These sons of God coming to earth and having sex with human women. It talks about the Tower of Babel. You're going to build a tower to reach to the heavens, and God knocks it down. It talks about Noah and the ark. It talks about reading the future in a couple of lines. We just think these things can't be taken serious. They just can't be. We know things don't work that way. But you know, the only reason we think we know things don't work that way is because we've never seen it. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that just because you've never seen something happen, that it can't happen. That's what a lot of people fall into when they read the Bible. Be cautious about dismissing the accounts in Genesis as myth and legend. And don't fall into the trap of thinking that science has the final say on the Bible. Now, I've tried to whet your appetite today for the book of Genesis in the hope that you'll go home and read it, because it is a fascinating book to read. It's almost like watching a soap opera on some things. It's got plots and twists and turns. It's got murders and deceptions and all sorts of things in there. It's full of all those juicy things that people like to go to the movies for. And it's really fascinating to read the book of Genesis. And keep in mind that when you read this, it represents some of the most ancient narratives that have survived from recorded history. And so I encourage you to go home and read the book of Genesis this week. Don't worry about what it means. And for God's sake, don't consult some preacher or some commentary book or something else, have someone tell you what it means. Just read the book of Genesis. See what it says. Notice the interesting things. Notice the flow of it. Get the big picture of it. Don't worry about what it means. Just read it and see what's in there. It's a fascinating book of